Hello, everyone. We are back, but this time is going to be a little different. We're not doing a live event because John is a very busy person, so we couldn't get a schedule from him. John, I would let you to introduce yourself because your experience is one of the rarity in our industry, coming from legal as well as being the CEO of a tech company. So this is something that you and I have spent a lot of time diving deep into the details, but I cannot repeat what you said. This is why that I need Sean to be here helping me to make this introduction so you can basically elaborate the months that we have been spending together and talk about the subject in cyber risk management related to financial industry and some of the particular vertical market segments within the financial industry. Now, of course, the most important part is the SEC regulatory issues that everybody is talking to me about and concerning about this. Sean, please make the introductions and then let John take it away.
Sure.
Thanks.
Just to be clear, the things that you couldn't say that John was saying is not that it's not safe for work. You just couldn't remember what he was talking about. It's so complicated sometimes.
I need to be, be careful with the detail. Legally defensible. That's what I
Legally
learned from
defensible.
John.
Legally defensible is always keeping your mouth shut.
That's right.
So today we have John Levane. John has over 20 years experience in the financial services, regulatory compliance and technology space. He's a rare unicorn in a lot of cases. Currently, he's a senior partner at Garris Horn. They're a boutique firm that specializes in assisting fintech in particular and financial institutions to build and deploy, adopt new technologies in this evolving dynamic market in security, data privacy. John, welcome. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you,
Thank
John.
you, Sean Stanley. It's a pleasure to be here. Like you said, John Levnick, God, 20 plus years. Where did the time
Can't
go?
can't tell from the gray hair, John.
Yeah, exactly. I wear it like a badge of honor. Um, Regulatory attorney, 20, 3 years now, and I've had the luxury of focusing on financial services, regulatory compliance, and technology became a really novel overlay to supplement my skill set. I'm old enough to have been around for a cycle or two, but young enough to still understand and grasp onto complex technology driven issues and work with emerging technology. We're fortunate that in our lifetime, the term emerging technology is really significant. In the last
Yes.
20 years, I've seen, I went to a company out of law school that was using a DOS based, approach for gathering data to a Clipper base to, all the way up through, modern day tech stack. I've seen the evolution, and I had kind of always had an academic interest in it, which led to professional opportunities. So I was very fortunate through the years to not only be attorney in house with a lot of companies that support the financial institutions, critical vendors that provide critical support and critical services to large banks and hedge funds and the various financial entities.
Right.
So I've always had a focus on governance, risk, compliance as it related to ensuring that these vendors fully understood what it meant to support these large financial institutions, and that the vendor always was in a position to understand and fulfill the obligations of their clients, the large financial institutions. And with the evolution of the statutory regulatory regime of cybersecurity and privacy, these obligations are growing. So it's a great opportunity. I had a wonderful opportunity a couple of years ago to start a fintech driven mission critical services firm for the large financial institutions doing issuing bonds. And the challenges that we had in that type of organization were that our clients were regulated by various prudential regulators with pseudo obligations to fiduciary obligations to state and federal regulatory bodies. So what that meant is that as a vendor, we had to understand the patchwork of governance, risk, and compliance obligations that our clients faced. And when we sought business from these large banks, we had to undergo a deep and very invasive look at our infrastructure. And our clients want to ensure that their consumer data, when it came into our hands, was not only safe, but it was secure. And not only as we used it internally, but as we moved it between our organization and what we had to establish were our dependent vendors, third and fourth generation vendors
Right.
that effectively supported us. Right? We used a critical technology that was an AWS native platform. Right? So we didn't have exclusive control over that. So we really made a concerted effort to go to market with a sophisticated cybersecurity footprint, because getting through vendor approval with these large organizations, opened up a number of opportunities and doors. A big thing we're seeing in financial services today is that these critical vendors do not understand nor have the appropriate controls in place to meet their clients' needs.
Right.
They,
They
they
should have a really
Wait,
cool
wait,
piece of
wait, wait.
software.
What
yeah,
do you mean there's no controls when there are tons of them, right? It's like, and that's why, John, that why I invited you to have this discussion, because, one thing is a lot of business executive from the top level saying, oh, wait, this is technology thing. It's like, I don't know, shove it down to the CISO, CIO, CTO point of view. And then when all the C-suites come together, talk about technical, nobody wants to listen.
yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
then it goes down into its own silo. You mentioned about data. So, and then of course it breaks it down into different branches and the technology. Everybody's has, their arms around their own data. No, no, I don't want to touch it. So this comes back into one of the largest company, whatever, in the global horse racing company. I don't want to mention name, of course. When years ago I talked to them, I said, well, how do you deal with cybersecurity? One of the common element, and they of course dealing with billions and dollars of business. And I talked to them. I I find out from that organization they have 8 business units. Each one of them has their own secure guidelines, framework to meet their whatever their department's needs are. And I say, how fragmented is that? And that, when it goes back into the board of directors, the C suites, coming from a regulations perspective, how do you control, how do you manage that? Then why, of course, that we want to tie this back into the recent news and the SEC. Now, all the board members and the C suites that they are personally that has some type of impact if there's a data breach. So it's not a technical matter anymore. So this is why we want to talk about this topic, and why now is because we want our audience to be aware. Hey, this is not a technical issue anymore. And in fact, in this, which we have been driving this cyber risk governance topics for the last few years, and we have been putting the platform in the last 6, 7 years, is not just focusing on the technical part. However, nobody wants to listen. And also, when they listen, they only want to hear the silo portion of it, not
Yeah.
and from a holistic point of view. So please, John, since you sat on both sides of the house in a sense, this is, I think we have a lot to learn from you.
That's yeah. As you highlight, Stanley, it's there's such a disparity between the reality of an infrastructure or a large financial institution's organizational controls from an IT perspective, and boards of directors are seasoned professionals. Many boards of directors, these large organizations, are persons that are retired later in their career and really may not have had a lot of exposure to technology, nor have a comprehensive understanding of technology necessary to meet what now is a fiduciary obligation to ensure that their organization has sufficient, well, we'll use reasonable and sufficient cybersecurity controls in place. As you mentioned, the liability of the boards of director, it's real. Um, the 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 importance of this Reg SK that's come out from the SEC, I'm not going to go down the path of talking about timelines and disclosures and 8K and 10K reporting obligations. I'm more concerned with whether or not these organizations can understand where their risk lies, and their risk is not necessarily in the obligation to report, but it's in the obligation to potentially mitigate the damage once a breach occurs.
Mhm.
It's been that kind of quiet joke that these organizations sometimes are so big they don't report breaches because they're not even aware that the breaches have occurred, right?
Yeah, you mentioned about so big, but then on the other end, oh, I'm so small. It's not going to, affect
Yeah.
me. What do you take on that? How do we say to the smaller guys in a sense?
The times have changed effectively, right? The SEC now says publicly traded companies have an obligation to not only report but to ensure that they have the reasonable controls in place, right? And on a case by case basis, depending on the extent of the breach and the potential harm it's done, their individual liability could hinge not only on breaches that occur within the confines of their organization, but breaches that occur to a critical vendor, and extends out to their obligation to oversee their vendors and their vendors, third, like I mentioned earlier, third and fourth generation technologies that maintain and house critical infrastructure. I was having a conversation this morning with a friend who's got a very significant job in a multi-cloud shop and a third-party services firm, and we were talking about the implications of the reg, and what's going on with ransomware, for example.
Mm.
And the fact that ransomware occurs, that's great. The second question is the fact that recovery, there's a recoverable path. That's fantastic. But when you're a critical financial institution, right? Your financial institution is critical for has an impact on global trade, right? Your recovery window, in this is back of the napkin kind of fodder. Recovery timelines extend out and sometimes upwards on average of 23 days.
Mm, wow.
23 days, right? So as you can tell, Mike, the conversation, Stanley, and what you and I talk about is it's not only protecting, but it's also having the appropriate infrastructure to recover in a timely and to mitigate your exposure. We all heard of the recent ransomware attack that occurred on a large Western you know gaming entity, right? And firsthand accounts of people walking across the floor where 80% of the video machines were down. And when those machines generate in excess of $1 million a day of revenue, 23 days of being down is pretty hard. So what I think the implications of, and what we really need to talk about as an industry, is not only in addition to having controls and the policies in place, but effectively giving these organizations the ability to recover. I mean, you guys do the math, right? You can have a great redundancy, you can have a great recovery plan, but if you're connected, using a third party tool, well, such as like a powerful one, right? Like AWS Direct Connect, right? On average, you get 10, GPS download capabilities. If you got to recover a database that's 2-3 petabytes, do the math.
Yeah.
Do the math on that. 10 GPS, at 2 petabytes, that's in excess of 7 months of time to download through that heavy pipe. That's not reasonable. So when talking about cyber, the importance is quantifying the exposure and the dollar risk through this regulation SK, but looking at practical means of not only mitigating the risk, but reducing. All right, you're going to get breached. Well, we've got to be efficient, and we've got to get back to operation as quick as possible, because at the end of the day, Stanley, you said it best. Board members are personally liable. They've been personally liable for a while now. But now the SEC has an avenue to hold board members to account. The SEC has not only the ability to create, write rules, they have the ability to enforce rules. And guess what? They enforce through litigation. And with litigation, there's copious amounts of discovery. And the SEC has created very subjective terms in Reg SK that permit them the wherewithal to make case-by-case determinations of sufficiency, of materiality. They're not going to give a hard and fast rule what that means. So as you said, the function of cybersecurity, legal ops, the term SecOps, right? DevOps, DevSecOps, whatever we want to put on it.
Interops.
It interrupts. It forces a munging of the brain trust of these large organizations to fully understand that, sure, red team, blue team, that's great. You've got the red team constantly banging on the windows and the doors, trying to access. And you got the blue team, holding back the doors of the fortress, from the red team attacks. But in the event that somebody gets through, you drop a firewall because you're provisioning more IOPS, right? To test the IOPS provisioning, you got to drop a firewall. Well, guess what? Somebody got in. And then you got to set into motion, what do you do? So cybersecurity doesn't end at the vector, at the penetration point. Cybersecurity and privacy controls go through the entire infrastructure, and the obligation to continually mitigate, to work with, the dev side, the vendors. This new paradigm that the SEC is kind of bringing to the table is going to force a material change in large organizations, not only from an awareness perspective and a risk mitigation perspective, but an operational perspective.
Yeah.
Not a single CISO out there, I guarantee you, knows whether or not that they're covered by, their directors and officers policy, right? Because they better be, because they're going to be the first to have to account to what occurred. And a CISO can no longer throw over the fence. Well, that's a CTO's job, not my job, right? Well, no longer. It's a collaborative effort that's required, and cybersecurity is going to consume these traditionally isolated verticals within an organization and have to basically run the show from what's the term we always use, the cybersecurity center of excellence, or but that's what it really is. It's got to be, change has got to be driven by the cybersecurity requirements, which expose liability and should control so much of the process.
So, John, with the new SEC rule, there was a lot of criticism about the SEC rule in the terms that it didn't spell out a lot of the more definitive things that people were looking for in this new rule. Is that because, from what you said earlier, is that they would rather set precedents through court cases and investigation and the due diligence process? They would rather follow that process to set the rules for everyone else to follow when somebody else trips.
Exactly. If they were
so they're going to be looking for a first victim to set precedents.
Yeah, and not even a victim. Each enforcement action is going to be an opportunity to clarify what they intended in the rule. So the rules have certain key elements that are specific, that are intended to be vague for intended purpose, right?
Right.
No two IT stacks look the same. No two governance structures look the same.
Right.
So they want the ability to go in on a case-by-case basis and make determinations of materiality, make the determinations of sufficiency based on the totality of the circumstances, right? And that allows them to clarify and define these regulatory terms of art through enforcement results, right? So if they give you an objective standard, the regulatory agencies are fearful that organizations will, through subterfuge, figure out how to navigate around them to find the exception or the loophole, I guess is the term, right?
Right.
So by keeping them intentionally vague, it allows them to identify, the standards when they see it, depending on the particular facts of that case. And that means that just about every enforcement action unless settled in advance. The SEC has an interest in seeing it through litigation
Right.
to get to those defined terms. And the industry needs to, and enter the lawyers, to closely monitor the litigation to see the judicial interpretation of this regulatory language to create a path that will guide them on how and what they should do or what the standards are. So it's going to be an evolution of an entire new body of law that's technology driven, right? We always joke, the lawyers and the tech folks really traditionally are divided by the risk folks, right? The risk folks keep the lawyers at bay and translate the ops, and now it's once again this munging of function that that requires that lawyers participate in assisting organizations in defining what the controls are, the sufficiency of the controls, what's appropriate for their organization based on who they are and what they do as an organization.
Have you started to see a change in the insurance for financial institutions relative to the D&O policy with these new rules coming into place? Because now, if the D&Os are responsible for certain security functions or attestation that the organization is doing certain security controls, that liability coverage now comes into play if they fail on this, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I never thought about how this might change the underwriting of D&O policies. Obviously the cyber risk policies are on the forefront, and the
Right.
sophistication of the insurers is grown immensely. No longer are they willing just to take written attestations as to controls and benchmarks, frameworks that they meet. Right? They want a demonstration on the command line now. They want to see the controls in action. They want to see the commercially recognized terms from a Microsoft, from an AWS,
Right.
from Google, right? To see what array of services they've knit together to create, the DLP or whatever the requisite controls might be. But the D&O now should have a seat at the table, because and maybe, I don't know, going on a limb here, maybe the pairing of a D&O and cyber become necessary, or disparate, right, for a risk function.
Right.
But I would imagine that if a carrier doesn't have the cyber policy and they're only offering D&O, that they're going to look to the credentials of the officers, the infrastructure, and at least the GRC program that the institution has at a high level to get comfortable whether or not that they're potentially exposing themselves to a payout. Because if they've got if they've got a CISO that doesn't understand the terms of the acronym for which their job holds, they're the ultimate payor on this, or payee.
Yeah. What's your take on the recent case with the whistleblower, the FCA in Pennsylvania? Should more organizations be concerned about that now that the DOJ is looking to enforce that? That's always been a conversation within the defense space within the CMMC, and whether the FCA was going to come into play.
Honestly, I'm not familiar of the terms of that particular case, so I'm not
But
necessarily.
in general, as far as whistleblowers within organizations, I would imagine the C-suite and the board is going to have to be worried about that as well if they're attesting to something and something's not occurring.
With the whistle, the availability of redress available to whistleblowers is meaningful, right? There's appropriate incentives to get the whistleblowers out there. But there's also the chilling effect that unsuccessful result based on a whistleblower's actions,
True.
could ultimately lead to the ostracization of the
Yeah,
exclusion of
that
that
hard word.
person from their career. So having a whistleblower that is a key person, it's vital. But yeah, it's it's not necessarily going to be, in my opinion, the avenue in which organizations have to worry about the most today. But it's another avenue, and the DOJ is arguably become a very political mechanism, as based on the headlines I read in these papers. So it could really vary based upon the administration and control. Where less so the SEC is, still an executive, entity of the executive branch, but more autonomous, more independent, and more interested in protecting consumers. So,
Based on this
With your
conversation, I have a question for John about, how this SEC impacting, is it just primary focus in the financial segments, financial market segment? Is it regional? How does it impact to the rest of the world?
publicly
In
traded
from
companies, publicly traded companies. So
Mm.
if you're a publicly traded company, regardless if you're financial, healthcare, gaming, you don't even have to be in a heavily regulated vertical. If you're in an industry where your data or the ongoing use of your services is critical, you're subject to these reporting obligations and the ultimate liability. It's
What about the mid-size, small-size company? What would they have impact? Of course, I know kind of one of the I'm leading to is the vendor risk management, right? The supply chain. So can you elaborate on that?
So yeah, so if you're a critical vendor to a publicly traded company, you don't have to be a publicly traded company to be involved in potential litigation. So if the vendor is the vector point for a breach into a publicly traded, and the vendor is a vendor to a publicly traded company, and it's been traced through you, the SEC is going to hold the publicly traded company liable for the actions of its vendors, even though that the vendor might not have any direct liability to the SEC themselves, if not but for the client. But these small non-publicly traded service providers have to act as if they were subject to this rule themselves to support their client base. We started, in Stanley, how you and I met was, talking about how my company structure was. We were small, but we had to understand what our clients' obligations were, and we had to prove to our clients that we could fulfill their obligations despite the fact we weren't directly regulated in the same manner they were. So these vendors, it's the same case. The
And
vendor,
I've been trying to convince the CPAs of the world. I mean, that I'm just an accountant. I have nothing to do with this. Why do I need to care about the cyber risk? Can you, from a legal counsel perspective, explain why they should care, or what kind of potential liability that their firm or organization liability they might have?
all right, my brotherhood of lawyers are going to get mad at me for saying this, but law firms are one of the highest risk entities for cyber attack, because
Because
of
you guys host a lot of juicy
we,
information.
we do, right? IPO filing, securities related work, enforcement, and GRC programs for large organizations, right? Topographical representations of a cloud infrastructure of a
Intellectual
critical.
properties.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a potential gold mine. But if that law firm is a penetration point, and say that law firm has single sign-on capabilities or accessibility points into a client's infrastructure in providing that, attempting to provide secure services, right? But effectively becomes the penetration point because of social engineering or a phishing. A paralegal opens up the wrong email, and code gets maliciously placed on the infrastructure of the law firm, which goes out at night and pings other clients who they have connectivity to. Some lawyers working late at night and going into a client's portal to deliver documentation or suck down documentation or data to do work. That's an entry point. So yes, all of the organizations, even the most
What would you foresee their liability, their potential liability that related to those publicly trading company, or not even publicly trading company, but global conglomerates? So I had the pleasure to talk to an SEC prosecutor, formal SEC prosecutor, and of course, that, and the way that one of the interesting thing you talked about the loophole, when Sean talked about the cyber insurance from a D&O perspective, is that a lot of publicly trading company, they might say, oh, we might not have a data breach, or are you really sure that you have the data breach? Just keep shifting it down. Well, we're not really sure, right? Because they want to avoid that public announcement that they got data breach. But what
Yep.
they did from the SEC prosecution point of view is like they look at the 10Qs. They
Mhm.
talk to the insurance company. Well, how come you all, all of a sudden you paid out so much money? Who did you pay it out to kind of, going from the back door, the loop, to try to cover that kind of loophole. So
Mhm.
that was a very interesting conversations, but again, going back into our target audience, which is the mid-size, small-size company. Hey, because why we don't want to talk to the publicly trading company, because they always believe, well, we got all kinds of money. I cover all kinds of legally defensible tactics, approach and strategy. Hey, I don't need you. You guys are just, so why? So we always try to educate or elevate cognizance for the
Yep.
mid-size to the small size, because they don't have that kind of resource. Now with this SEC regulatory framework that is going to be pushing that financial burden into the to the mid-size SME and company. So what would your tip to be for them? And of course, one thing that we were, AI is always, we got to talk about AI, right? So people, my audience know, how much I love AI already. But yes, we need to have automations. But one thing that we learned is, how does automation really benefit to the operational efficiency, and why? Why do they need to care with this SEC? What is the potential impact? You touch on that. But again, I think that tying into your expertise, which is perfect to provide them with some tips and informations and insights. What you touch on, business continuity plan,
Yep.
right? The 23 days. It's like we've been talking about for years. When they engage with us, the first thing that we looked at from a technologist point of view, have you ever tested your data, your backup data?
Mhm.
And 90% of the 95% of the people come back saying, huh? What is that?
Yep.
Because they don't know. The IT vendor, the cybersecurity vendor, always trying to push new product to them, but never go back and look at what they have implemented, and never assess it from a risk. And you touch on that as well, from a risk point of view. And how does that correlate into the GRC? Because that becomes more of a priority from our perspective, from my perspective, rather than the technical side of it. Because that is, like you said early in this conversation, is real,
Yep.
is now personally liable. Yes, but even though they might not be publicly trading company, but actually is worse for the mid-size SME, because they might go bankrupt. Because when that being pushed down from the publicly trading company via the vendor risk management, and now we already helping clients that, because their customer or their potential customer demanding they have to comply with ISO, GDPR, or NIST, whatever the regulatory is, like you said, as a framework, might not be, from a regulation point of view, might not be directly affected, but definitely is in the process of pushing down to the bottom of the barrel.
A lot of discussion points in that statement. Thank you. Starting off with the biggest risk to the midsize. For these entities who are not directly regulated, but make a living off supporting these large publicly traded companies, the biggest risk is twofold, in my opinion. One, headline risk. Nobody wants to be named as a penetration point or a vector for a breach. Second is, in the event that there is culpability or liability of that company, the potential loss for cyber insurance, a policy being canceled, and the inability to obtain the requisite cyber insurance to continue to support those clients, because maintaining a policy upwards of $5 or $10 million, is a condition precedent to being a vendor to these large organizations, right? Because they want somebody that, in the event of an event that they're responsible for, that there's deep pockets that they can go out and collect from. So, losing your cyber insurance could be fatal for one of these mid-sized companies, because you can't support your target client base any longer.
Right.
So, that's the danger. For the other points that you made, which were, spot on. I don't even know where to start. Like,
We need a few more of this
yeah,
event.
yeah, exactly. At the end of the day, it's vital that people pay attention to where the regulatory winds are blowing. The historical reliance upon purely meeting frameworks or benchmarks, it's a good baseline, but at the end of the day, these rules are created recognizing that each organization is novel in its own infrastructure and how it functions, and thus relying upon benchmarks and frameworks should be done the same way. They're great reference points, but at the end of the day, if you say that your ISO 27001, if your NIST, name your applicable NIST, right? Your CIS benchmark is applicable to the services that you're using. That's good that you at least know what your obligations are, but you now need to show your work. You need to show how you meet those, and you need to show, the novelty of your organization, that, the benchmarks here, our organizations here, and here are the gaps that we're accommodating because we're working with affiliates. We've got other companies under our common control. Big thing we're seeing now is that parent companies, through this venture capital explosion we've had, parent companies have wholly owned subsidiaries and affiliates that draw from common services, right? So if you've got a parent company who's providing a CTO, CISO as a service to all the child companies, right? What does that look like? How does that apply? What are the controls as it relates to this each individual entity, not just the parent hold company? So the novelty of each company is vital to understand, and that when these companies explain how they're designed, how they meet their obligations, it needs to be a story. The story needs to make sense, and the story needs to be comprehensive. So there's not a one size fits all solution to any of these answers, and it requires a deep and intimate relationship with a third party that can come in, direct you on what you need to do, assess the sufficiency of what you're doing, make recommendations on how you need to get better, whether that's done as an ongoing service, as a periodic check, that's up to the companies. But, Stanley, you and your team bring such vital expertise to the marketplace that it's I always say, I don't know what I don't know. And sometimes I need a third party to tell me what I don't know, right? Because I'm so caught up in what I've built and what I've designed, and my head down into what I've done. You need fresh eyes. You need fresh thoughts and fresh opinions. These things are changing quickly, and it never hurts to have a periodic look by a third party, or just a reliance on a third party that is staying abreast of the changes, that can continually see best practices among organizations, right? Oh, I bring this knowledge because I've seen this work really well here, and this would work here because you have common elements of your infrastructure. It's this apprehension to expose what you're doing to third parties is only going to cause a lot of heartache and pain for these large organizations and these mid-tier organizations.
Yeah, and the story that you mentioned, and also we've been talking about that is, it has to be unbiased. It has to be vendor neutral as well too, because otherwise, it's like, even though, thank you for the compliment, and even though we've been in this field for so long, but we still don't know everything, and that's why one of the principle that we engage with expert like you, expert in different part of the consultants and companies, even technology companies, because nobody knows it all. I keep saying even IBM have to outsource some of their stuff to some of the expertise. Doesn't matter who they are. So part of it is being unbiased, and why we're building this ecosystem partnership is because what we learn from expert like you is the separation of duties. Not just coming from a third pair of eyes coming to looking into what we do as from a comprehensive holistic approach, but also is the depth into this subject. I keep talking about, I might be a great sales engineer. I can sell a lot of things, but can I really engineer it? And that's why back in my old days, actually, I go to the, when there is a new technology deployed, actually, I follow the technician and learn from them, learn from the actual
Mhm.
engineer. And I think that's why we built up this community, is the constant learning that require. And now this message is really for the business executive like ourselves, that small companies, small boutique firms, but they thinking, okay, now back then I got my IT team, I got my vendor taking care of it. But I think what I learned from you, John, is that possible deniability cannot exist and will not exist anymore, because that is diminishing by days, and now everything is go back into legally defensible. And one of the things that, when I talk to one of the state's attorney general and say, look, they got thousands of cases every year, but they picking out which company is not following their best practice and just shove it off, and doesn't, and ignore this type of risk factor.
Mhm.
Those are the one that they're going to pick out for prosecution and examples like Sean has talked about.
Yeah.
So Sean,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say the storytelling has always been the documentation of policies and procedures. It's always easy to bring out the binders that say, this is what we do, this is how we do it. And oftentimes, the non technical executives believe that they're in compliance if everything is well documented and organized in binders to be able to present to auditors. But it's really not. They need to understand the magic behind the curtain. And it's and many times that's coming from the IT or security solutions that they don't understand.
Yeah.
And so it's, how is the best way for that non-technical executive to accept the decision by their internal auditing that they are in compliance and look to their technical team and say, are we? How do they trust what they don't understand?
Yeah, I think this is a good time to take a break, because we haven't touched on that with John yet from that technical perspective. We've been talking about a lot from the SEC regulatory framework perspective. So we're going to invite you back, John. For our audience, stay tuned. I think this, we need to have
For
a
part
part two.
two,
This is a great conversation. So meanwhile, yes, John, we know you're busy and really appreciate you taking, the lawyer's hours for us to elevate the connaissance for our audience. Really appreciate it. And we'll arrange another time to continue our this discussions on the technical part of things. Thank you, John. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Sean. All right.
John,
Thank you
Bye,
all.
appreciate it.
everyone.
Take care.
Take care.